we're joined now by David Davis. I think I just called you a big beast of the Conservative right. Are you happy with that? A former Brexit secretary, a former shadow Home Secretary. What is the big beast, Davis?
Normally speaking, in politics, if you get called a big beast or a senior Conservative, it's because you're in trouble. So I'm not entirely sure.
Or because you're nearly dead.
One or the other, yes, that's right. I'm probably closer to the nearly dead than the in trouble this time, but it's fine. Yeah, I am a well-known member of the Tory right, put it that way.
I'm going to start by talking about Suella Braverman's language yesterday. Mm-hmm. Right. She used that word invaders when she was in the Commons. We just spoke to a former permanent secretary at the Home Office who said Suella Braverman's language yesterday was inflammatory. Do you think it was?
Well, it's not language I would have used, but, if you're at the dispatch box, you're under pressure, not just on that subject, but on things that have gone before and so on. You can understand people say things under stress. And also...
She didn't look very stressed.
Oh, I think she was stressed. I mean, in that case, she was a wonderful actress because there was a lot of pressure on her yesterday. And the simple truth is, her own words, that the system is broken, it's overwhelmed. And so you have a Home Secretary in charge of a department that is actually overwhelmed by one of its major responsibilities. And that's what I think pressured her into using that sort of language.
It's the kind of language you'd use if you've just had to come in and clear up somebody else's problems, not your own party, who's had free rein with the immigration system and service for 12 years.
No, look, I understand what's happened in the last year or so. There's been a systemic problem in the Channel for some time. But in the last year, the size of the problem has pretty much doubled. You've got 12,000 Albanian migrants arriving, for example. The Albanian gangs, who are, it's a strange thing to say about them, but they're the most efficient gangsters in Britain. They're very effective at what they do, and they find these opportunities. They've found this opportunity of basically trafficking people into Britain, and it's overwhelmed the system. I wouldn't say she's blaming it on predecessors so much as blaming it on the circumstance. And plenty of things I disagree with Suella on, but I don't demur from her on that.
But David, even before the Albanian situation really got going this year, there were enormous backlogs in the asylum system.
Yeah.
Of all the people who arrived on small boats in 2021, Home Office officials said just the other day that north of 96% still hadn't received a result.
That's right. That's right.
So it isn't really about the Albanians overwhelming the system. It's made it worse, but the system was already overwhelmed.
Well, it was a degree of being overwhelmed, sure. It was not coping before. That's certainly the case.
And the government has been in office for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
And it's happened under their watch.
But, look, it's happened on both watches. Bear in mind, I was Shadow Home Secretary when Blair was in charge, and we had massive migration then. And then it was almost with the compliance of the government. They were saying one thing in public and actually letting something else happen in private. That's why 2 Home Secretaries lost their jobs on my watch. So it's a long-standing systemic problem, and it's been made worse by a number of things. Most recently, the sort of non-cooperation of the French has made it difficult.
Let's just pause on that whole question of non-cooperation from the French, because we've just had a Prime Minister in office who said she didn't even know if Emmanuel Macron was a friend or foe. If that's the kind of language, and to be fair, she wasn't the first. We heard the same kind of games from Boris Johnson over the last few years as well, treating the French as if they were somehow out to trip up this country or out to get the better, or if it was all a game or a battle. We could have worked a lot better at relations with the French post-Brexit.
Maybe. The truth is the French were the most, I guess, of the nations of Europe, the most resentful of Brexit. And Macron played to that to some extent. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be diplomatic back. We should. In my view, is the best way of dealing with that is to overwhelm it with diplomacy, which has not been necessarily the government's approach to it.
Particularly when we need them. At this point, with immigration, more than they need us. They're the gatekeepers.
There are issues on both sides in that relationship. And now I think, actually, Sunak has quite rightly basically made effectively an overture to the French. I think because the politics, now that Macron's been re-elected, the politics has changed a bit, domestic politics has changed a bit, and Sunak's doing the right thing because actually it is within the capacity of a hyped up or a better organised surveillance operation by us and a better organised interception organisation by the French to double the amount, the effectiveness.
So on
of
the
French
one hand,
operation.
he's made this overture to Macron. Mm-hmm. It looks as if relations there could be improving. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, he's appointed this Home Secretary who's literally created not only a security massive headache for your government, but also a bottleneck in Kent, in a detention centre, by not moving people out.
Yeah. I mean, I think you'll find the Albanian operation has actually doubled the number of people effectively going through. That of itself creates a bottleneck. The other problem they've got is where to put them once they're in Britain. I mean, already you're seeing today, reported in the press, a number of local councils saying, no, you can't put them in hotels in our council area. There have been court cases going on. So they're running into other problems as well. So I don't think it's just the Home Secretary doing that.
Does she have your confidence?
Well, look, she's doing the most difficult job in government under circumstances which are more difficult than, let's say, when Amber Rudd was Home Secretary or whatever. So I'm not one of these people who leaps to say, oh, you haven't succeeded in 2 days, you've got to go, or 4 weeks, or whatever it is. This is a department which has always been the most difficult to run a government. I remember when Jack Straw had been, who's an old friend of mine, had been Home Secretary, and he once said to me, I went to bed every night knowing that about a dozen people in my department could end my career the next day, because there are so many of these balls in the air that can go wrong. That's what's happened here.
She doesn't need anyone in her department to end her career, quite frankly. I mean, she admitted herself 6 security breaches.
No, that may be your view, Emily. It's not mine. I said, look, the problem here is very substantial.
But wait a second, don't just laugh that off, because on the one hand, we are dealing with a real, tangible, horrific, difficult situation with immigration.
Yeah.
And on the other, we're dealing with a reappointed Home Secretary who has created and caused major security breaches. Now, in most of the public's mind, those two things would be incompatible. Don't put somebody who creates security breaches in charge of the most difficult brief in government.
But you're conflating two somewhat separate issues. I mean, let's deal with, as much as I understand, what happened with what you call a security breach. She shared documents she shouldn't have shared, let's be plain about that, confidential documents. They weren't top secret. Now, that's a bad mistake. It's actually one which I think she was right to resign for in the first case, but Rishi Sunak obviously thought it was not sufficient to prevent her being reappointed. He's more informed than I am on this subject. But I wouldn't conflate that with this issue, and I don't think the public conflates that with this issue of immigration. What's going to happen in the next few months is this is going to become not just a national issue, it's going to become a local political issue. I sort of half agree with you in terms of, well, it's appearing in Tories. It's not just Tory seats, it's appearing in seats, constituencies up and down the country. You're going to have migrants placed there in hotels, in other temporary accommodation, and people are going to be very, very conscious of what was for many people a sort of distant issue they didn't really approve of, but now it's a very, very local issue to them. And that's going to make it very politically sensitive. And that at least I agree with.
But David, isn't that precisely the reason why talking about an invasion is such a mistake? Because we know how high tensions are running in places like Kent. We know that there is a counter-terrorism investigation going on right now because of the events of what happened over the weekend. Yeah. I mean, when you've got the Home Secretary quite literally using language like that could inflame this problem further, isn't that a problem?
I mean, look, we're at great risk of sort of, over the decades, is of both politicians and media focusing on what makes the headlines rather than what's substantive. So you end up with people and governments chasing harsh-sounding policies because they sound tough rather than effective policies because they work.
Just pause there. Where are you on Rwanda? Because
I'm against Rwanda. I'm against the Rwanda policy. I voted against it.
So when Suella Braverman talks about her dream...
That's the arguments of rhetoric. That's precisely what I'm saying about focusing on the headline, and it's true of politicians and media types too. My view is that we have to focus on the mechanics of this, and that's what's going wrong. What we haven't got is a streamlined system. So if there's a failure here, whoever it's for, whether it's a current Home Secretary or a previous one or even a previous government, the failure here is our systems are badly designed. And I believe in asylum. I believe it's something we as a country is a great source of pride to us. For centuries we've been a great source of asylum for people who've been intimidated and murdered by tyranny.
David, just to take you back.
I'll come back to it. The point is we can solve this, I think. My criticism is not about the language. My criticism is not about the emotive sense. It's about actually the facts on the ground, changing the facts on the ground. That's what we have to do.
All right, before you go, Matt Hancock is about to enter the jungle. What is the David Davis view on Matt Hancock, a sitting MP in the jungle?
Well, I've had to eat unpleasant things in the past and survive in the jungle, but I've never done it on television, and for good reason. It's not a very dignified look.
But it's not only not dignified, it's at the expense of the constituent and the taxpayer.
Yeah, well, that's for them to judge, the constituency in particular to judge. I wouldn't do it.
I mean, the whip has been taken away. Do you think it should stay away? I
Do you think that's the end of his political career?
I think Matt must have decided that it probably was the end of it. Not the end of his career, but he wasn't intending to come back. I mean,
Whatever, from Australia.
No, just back into government. I think there'll be a lot of articles about Matt, possibly coming back into cabinet and so on. I think he's probably written that off because he can't do his job as an MP. That's the point. He can't do his job as an MP. He can't do his job as a constituency MP. He can't vote in issues in the House.
Do you think there's much difference between that and, say, Boris Johnson going off on holiday for 3 weeks to the Caribbean or speaking abroad and so on?
Well, presumably he's got clearance for his holidays. We all go. I was due to be going to Syria last week before we.
That's what
presumably that wasn't a holiday.
Right? That wasn't a holiday. That was to do with Shemima Begum.
Yeah.
But we all go away from time to time, and the Whip's office makes a judgment. Is it appropriate? Do we give you a slip? Do we pair you? Whatever we do. Plainly, that hasn't happened here, and plainly he's been penalised for it, and I'm afraid rightly so. If you're not doing your job, then having the whip withdrawn is an appropriate response.
David Davis, thanks.